Right. Hello, everyone. Time for another little waterside chat. So, again, I'm on a boat, but again, not actually on the waterside. I'm up on sticks or on the hard. So, actually, I'm down the bottom end of the boatyard this time, a place they call the place of broken dreams. So, I'm not sure why they put me here. Um, so, right at the bottom of the boatyard, up on sticks, I look out over a little patch of wasteland and a little pond and everything. So the other day I was looking out and I saw this little dog wandering along the side of the pond. Had little pointy ears like an Alsatian, but a curiously mottled kind of coat. And I'm like, what sort of dog is that? And then it sort of started running, and it ran in a sort of trotty sort of way like a fox. And I'm like, oh, maybe that's not a dog. Thought it was a dog. Now it's not a dog. Maybe it's a coyote. I didn't. I thought they only lived out in Roadrunner country, so I looked up coyotes, and yes, they do live around here in Vancouver. So bit by bit, I realised that the original assumption, looking at the shape of the thing, the ears, the tail, and so on, that there was this dog. That actually it turns out it was a coyote, and looked at the pictures, the coat color matches, and everything. So there's something that happens here when we recognise a thing as humans, and this is somewhere where we need to contrast between understanding how human and other brains work on the one hand, and figuring out what we do with formal ontologies, because we're not trying to faithfully replicate brains. Brains are terribly unreliable things. And, often when you do an ontology and you talk about meaning, somebody pops up and says, oh, but late Wittgenstein and language games and this. And it's like, yeah, we know how brains work. It's different. And it's different in important ways. So think about a brain, right? You've got these neurons. The neuron has a long part that's the axon, and it has a signal that comes out at the bottom of the axon. So, like a truth value, true or false, this thing happened or didn't, and a whole set of what they call dendrites, like tree branches, with other axons coming into them. So you've got lots of stuff coming in, one thing going out. Now, obviously, you've got lots of these working together in parallel. You think more of clusters of neurons, but the behavior is pretty easy to track in terms of even how an individual neuron behaves. So the best example is if you look at a chicken. Now a chicken will be sitting there quietly pecking away, and say we used to have a cat that had a funny sense of humour, would creep up on these chickens, and bit by bit the chicken would start to get a little more worried and a little bit more whatever, and you can see as the cat gets nearer, the chicken has there's more and more signals coming in saying, "Oh, I need to do something about this." And then eventually the axon fires off, and the chicken runs away squawking, and the cat loves it. So um, that kind of what you can think of as a chicken reactor, if you like, is a simple description of how the different signals coming in cumulatively add up until they reach a threshold, and it is an actual firing threshold where the neuron fires and you have this truth value, and it might be connected to the runaway part of the cerebellum or whatever chickens have for a cerebellum or whatever, or it might be for it is true that I'm seeing a coyote, or it is true that I'm seeing a fox or a dog or whatever. And so when we recognize things, some of us, somebody might look at the pointy ears of a thing, somebody else will look at the tail, is it a bushy tail? Somebody looks at the coat color. Different ordinary humans will cumulatively add up different sets of inputs to draw the conclusion there is a dog, there is a coyote, or whatever. And of course, once one conclusion's come out, the way the neurons are all stacked together is that causes a suppression to come into all the others. So once you see a dog, you no longer see a coyote, and vice versa. You've got this toggling thing, particularly with visual stuff like the cube illusion, where you either see the cube one way out or the other, but never both. The outputs from one suppress the inputs to the others. So that's how we recognize things. But if you're doing an ontology, you're doing something. You're creating an engineering artifact. You're creating something that tries to capture the business reality, whether it's for use in reporting or common understanding or to inform what we do with data and so on. We'll look about data a bit more in a bit. Um, when we're doing an ontology, it's a bit like when somebody, Dr. Johnson, first invented the idea of a dictionary. You had the English language very fluid, really only 100 years since it had really become that language. So you got all the creativity of playwrights like Shakespeare and so on. You've got no correct spellings, no standardization, And then the dictionary produced this idea that, well, what if everybody uses the same words in the same way and writes them down the same and so on? It works because it's artificial. It works because it does the opposite of how ordinary human, neural behavior emerges. And so when we want to get everybody on the same page in an organization or across an industry or something, we want to create a common ontology, whether it's for finance terms or, trading, marketing, supply chains, whatever. We want to do artificially something that brains don't do naturally. We want to get away from that fluid way that different humans look at different properties to decide when something is a dog or a fox or a coyote. So what we do is we create these logical, what we call logical axioms, the really logical formulae or equations that say, if it's this and this and this, and not that, for example, and two of these and a union of those, when this whole expression is true, these are the necessary and sufficient conditions that say if all of these things are true of a thing, then it's a member of this class of thing. And if there's one property missing, it's not a member of this class of thing. If you've got all the properties of a contract but only one party, and it's necessarily the case that a contract has two or more parties, then what you have is not a contract. Perhaps it's a pledge or a deed or something. It has most of the other terms that a contract would have. So ontologies artificially and for good reasons standardize what we all agree as a given community are the defining characteristics that will say something is exactly this kind of thing or is exactly not this kind of thing. Now, many of those properties are inherited from more general classes, just like having pointy ears is something that lots of animals have. Having ears is what most animals have, and then some are pointy or invisible or rounded or whatever. So, or floppy in the case of many dogs. So what you have is a consensus across an industry or an organization that says what will we define as being the necessary characteristics, or what we call the truth makers, effectively. What we're saying is, what are the things that would be true for this thing to be true? Now, they may be true inherited through more general things, and then there's a distinguishing, usually one or two distinguishing characteristics from, say, the fox, the dog, the coyote, everything else about them's the same, but here's what marks them out. But all the other inherited common properties also add up to these are the things which, if they're true, then Coyote equals true. If they're not true, then it doesn't. And so those are what we call truth makers. They're how we use an ontology to find real things in the world. Now, we haven't talked about data. People often think of ontology as a kind of data model. And actually what they're doing, when you create an ontology purely as a data exercise using RDF data and so on, you're actually combining two quite important disciplines. One is ontology. What are the truth makers that define what it means to be a thing? And that we normally want to describe purely in logic without any reference to any data or application or anything like that. But then what are the evidences of each of those things? For each of the things that make something true, what am I looking for with my eyes or with my data or whatever it is? What are the effectively the things that allow us to assert that truth? What are the things that say, for that truth maker to be present, what am I looking for that tells me that that thing is there? And that's where data comes in. We can say, okay, now we can look at the truth values of data or of sensory inputs or whatever there is that tell us that that thing in the world is in play, and combined with these other things in the world, it means, hey, this is a coyote, this is a a balloon loan, or whatever the thing is, this is a contract, and so on. And so that gives us a way to come from the real world meanings, the truth value, the truth makers of something, to what are the truth bearers, what are the data surrogates, the things that would exist in data which reliably and only correspond to the existence of that truth maker in the world. And that allows us to then run a reasoner, for example. The moment you run a reasoner in an OWL ontology, people think of OWL as ontology, as meaning. Some people even think that you need the reasoner for it to be meaningful at all. Actually, what the reasoner does is prove it's not meaningful. It proves it's consistent and therefore capable of being meaningful. But what the reasoner is doing is it's doing a little piece of epistemology. It's now saying, given this data with its truth values, here are some output truth values, here's what we know about the world. So again, I've always been big on separating concerns. The ontology that describes what things really mean, you have to get that defined and agreed and consensus in order to then look at what the data surrogates are that allow you to run things like reasoners to determine the truth of things in the world, and not try and mistake a dog for a coyote or a coyote for a dog. So that's my little thought for this time around. This has been a Waterside chat, and we'll see you again soon.